Hello everyone, this is Dan with a new video. I wanted to kind of touch upon a topic that Stardusk has talked about in the past that I haven't seen very many other people really give commentary on. But it's interesting because I've noticed the same thing for a number of years, where there is this obsession with everything having to be positive all the time with a large number of people in our society today. And the emphasis is kind of always on being optimistic and imagining only the best possible outcome, even when the best possible outcome is kind of not realistic whatsoever. So, in his videos, Stardust talked about how this is related to the SJW movement, but that you also have a lot of people who wouldn't consider themselves SJWs who still, nonetheless, constantly tell everyone that they need to be positive all the time, and that in itself can basically resolve any difficulties that you may be encountering. And I wanted to talk about in this video kind of the underlying reasons why I think this is, why we see this positivity police phenomenon, and some of the conclusions that you can draw from this for your own life when you encounter people who insist on you being positive no matter what it is that you're actually dealing with. So, in today's culture, our education system teaches children to value self-esteem, feeling good, and the idea that everyone just deserves a desired outcome. Everyone's entitled to a certain result, regardless of performance. So instead of requiring children to meet specific goals and preparing them to make good life choices, we oftentimes, in our education system today, set aside their actual performance and their potential limitations in favor of making them comfortable and happy. The general theme is basically valuing everyone's feelings over practicing rational thinking and fact-based analysis. As time has gone on, this tendency has grown more extreme. Even since the time when I was in school, which hasn't been that long ago, I think it's become more of a staple within our education system, even for kids in elementary school. And now we have things not just in elementary school or high school, but in colleges as well. We have things like safe spaces and trigger warnings, and this concept that everyone should win a prize, regardless of whether you've been outperformed or regardless of whether your performance merits any sort of prize. So, in our society, because thinking positively all the time is used in place of learning to adapt to failure or in overcoming negative circumstances, people are often just not instilled with real problem-solving skills through the education process and through their rearing, from the time that they're children. Thinking based on evidence, like I've said, is just not always instilled in people in this kind of environment. And so for those who have not developed these skills, it becomes difficult when real-life issues that involve only negative choices, only negative alternatives invariably come up. In life, you're going to have circumstances, in other words, where there really is no good choice, and if you just say, well, I have to be positive, that's not going to help you there. You have to be able to look at the downside of things to minimize your potential pain and to make the best decision possible. And with our education system being what it is, and people from a young age not learning how to do this, I think they just completely lose their ability, or they never learn the ability to actually deal with problems in this manner. So when people who fit this profile of a member of the positivity police, or a profile of someone that has to be positive all the time, when someone like this encounters others who are dealing with a negative situation, showing empathy and compassion for this negative situation may also fall out of their life skill set, fall outside of that skill set, because they already lack real-world coping mechanisms. Again, everything's just positive. That's their main coping mechanism. It can become difficult to acknowledge and show compassion for others who are facing these kinds of circumstances. They are ill-equipped to show any kind of support or even to acknowledge the negative conditions of others in the first place, or, if it's their problem, even their own situation. But they also can't really be honest about this without suffering negative consequences either socially or in terms of their self-esteem, which they do everything to protect because that's all they've been taught. So you have these people who they're confronted with negative situations and they really are just not capable of dealing with that. So, in my view, telling a person to, quote, be positive is ultimately a compromise to avoid acknowledging a problematic situation while still appearing to be supportive. The basic idea is that if someone would simply be more positive, he could find a solution to whatever the problem entailed, and he wouldn't be facing the prospect of negative consequences in the first place. Now, what does this really imply? It implies that the negative person, the supposedly negative person, is solely to blame for the aspects of his dilemma, while the positive person making this claim avoids having to show any real empathy or compassion for the other individual. In cases where the so-called positive person is the one with the actual problem, the situation can be reversed when confronted with making a painful decision or acknowledging the reality of the situation. Now, anyone trying to help by pointing out the nature of the problem becomes the one who supposedly needs to be more positive. In either case, the responsibility is placed 100% on whoever isn't supposedly being positive enough, while the person who claims to be positive really just doesn't have to deal with it. Now, before I continue with this video, I want to make it clear that I'm not talking about whining when I mean compassion or empathy for other people. I'm not talking about the idea that, well, you should just feel bad for everyone that's going through a difficult situation. Even if it is their own fault, you're supposed to want to help them, or you have this obligation to somehow insert yourself into that situation to make it better. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is, if someone is actually a person that you want to help, if somebody is actually in a situation that you want to address, the way to do that is not to say be positive. That is a way of dismissing the situation. So for example, let's say you have a friend who's making some bad choices, and that friend is telling you about their problems. Telling them to be positive is in no way helpful, because it doesn't give them any sort of line of thinking. But let's say, for example, that person needs to make better decisions. It really is pretty much 100% that person's fault for why they're still in a particular dilemma or a particular situation. The way to do that is to say, hey, I want what's best for you. I want you to meet your goals. I care about your well-being. But you need to stop doing this, or you need to make a different choice here, because otherwise you're not going to get a better result. You're important to me, you're my friend, but I can't really do this for you. You need to make a better choice here. That is the adult way. That is the mature way. That is actually the compassionate way of dealing with someone in that type of situation. But when you just say be positive, you're not even acknowledging that person's situation to begin with. You are using that as a cheap substitute for compassion instead of just saying, I don't care about you. So again, what it really boils down to is people say this to avoid dealing with the situation for what it is, and to avoid even considering what you might be going through by just, in a roundabout way, assuming that it's your fault. And if you would just be more positive, then all of a sudden everything could be better. Again, people who are basically part of this positivity movement, they have to think this in order to basically avoid dealing with your negative situation, or avoid having a negative emotional reaction, because they, again, in many cases have not been taught how to handle that, because their education system and their upbringing just taught them that everything was about how they feel, and everything was about them getting what they wanted all the time, and they can't mentally emotionally deal with negative situations when they come up. Now, other variants of the positivity argument. There are other variants of this that essentially mean the exact same thing, in my opinion. Other variants of this include things like, oh, things could always be worse, or just don't be negative. You're too negative. Or, and this may be my favorite one, you have a bad attitude. All of these statements have a similar effect in holding you or some other person exclusively responsible for some sort of problem without expressing any real empathy or providing any sort of alternative solution for that person. The real meaning conveyed by these types of statements, in my view, is I am unable to or don't wish to deal with your problems. That's really what it is. And instead of just being honest about that, they try to make it sound like they're being supportive, but really they're dismissing whatever the situation is completely. They're completely dismissing whatever the issue is, and they're pretending at the same time that somehow they want to help you. Somehow they're on your side. But, you just need to be more positive to magically fix whatever the situation is, whether it's their situation or yours. So, of course, in some situations, the motivation for this is based more on the person with the problem rather than the inability to cope with negative situations. This inability to deal with real-life scenarios that only have negative choices, or primarily negative choices, or what you would call negative because they're difficult. That is a big part of why you see this positivity movement, but a lot of it is just people who, they just don't care about anybody other than themselves, or at least they don't care about the person with the actual difficulty, with the actual problem. So men especially are not shown compassion because of expectations placed onto them by society. Men are often seen as utilities who must perform a specific function rather than as end goals in themselves. And this may come into play when a man brings up a particular problem that really doesn't affect someone else. Nobody else really has a reason to care because it's not going to have a negative effect on them. And if you're a man, you're just supposed to handle everything yourself anyway. Again, thinking, quote, positively often becomes a method for dismissing real issues when you think the other person needs to handle the problem himself, whatever the issue is. But being obviously rude wouldn't be in good taste. It's a measure to dismiss the supposedly negative person's concerns or troubles while still seeming to be supportive of that person's problems. So it's a social strategy, in my view, that people develop a lot of the time alongside this inability and kind of unwillingness to cope with actual negative life situations. So while there may be more than one catalyst behind the always be positive attitude, the core issue is usually a lack of empathy or the inability to cope with the situation that has a negative context because, again, a lot of people just have not been prepared for this in life. And it's just going to continue to get worse, in my view, as new generations of kids that are part of this kind of everyone deserves a prize, everyone's a special snowflake culture, when they're thrust into real-life situations, they're going to have this, you just need to be more positive attitude because they can't analyze things and they can't deal with emotional pain. They have not learned coping mechanisms to deal with that other than just telling everyone to be positive all the time. So ultimately what the typical person in the positivity police really means is essentially I either don't care about or am too immature to deal with the problem. But saying this could result in negative social consequences, so I'll tell you to be more positive and act like that means something instead. That's really the compromise that's reached here at a subconscious level, I think. And of course, if the person with the problem is one of these people who has to have everything be positive all the time, it's not so much a negative social consequence if they say, if someone trying to give them advice, and again, Stardusk mentioned this, where he talked about how he had a friend who basically was not making very good decisions, and he tried to help him several times, and he just kind of ignored or pretended to forget the advice, or maybe he did forget the advice, and then eventually he just said, you need to be more positive with the advice that you're giving me. Maybe if you be more positive, I could handle this. That's the implication of that kind of response. In that scenario, it's not so much avoiding a negative social consequence, but it devalues your self-esteem. If you would acknowledge what someone else is advising you to do in that situation, it's going to break down your self-esteem. You're going to have to acknowledge that what you're doing now is not sufficient, that you need to make a change, that what you're doing is essentially not good enough, and you have to take a different course. And again, if you have not been taught how to do that, and you've been taught that even though you finished last place in some sort of contest or event, that you deserve a prize anyway, if that is how you have been taught, if that's how your personality is formed, then ultimately you're not going to be able to deal with that potential blow to your self-esteem. So again, you're just going to tell someone else, well, your advice is negative. I need only positive advice, because they can't handle, psychologically, they have not been given the skill set to handle actually dealing with real life scenarios that involve negative consequences. So, this kind of response from people in the positivity police, when they tell you you need to be more positive all the time, this isn't true advice. It's just a form of virtue signaling. And I think that's another thing that they have in common with the SJWs, with the social justice warriors. They don't really know how to function in terms of dealing with reality, so they end up virtue signaling on things and not really giving advice, and just kind of using these psychological mechanisms to avoid pain and to pretend like, they're on the side of what's righteous in the case of SJWs, because that's easier and that falls into their skill set, rather than actually having values, or rather than actually thinking about things based on real-world consequences and based on actually wanting to resolve a situation for what it is. So what is the point in this video? I always like to get to the conclusion here and frame it that kind of way. What is the point in me talking about the positivity movement, the positivity police? Identifying someone as a member of the positivity police is a major red flag for making any sort of interpersonal progress with that person. And I want to mention that it is important to assess whether you or someone else is actually being too negative about a particular situation. You have to assess, okay, what are the facts here, and am I only seeing the negative aspects of something, and does this person have a point that I need to be more positive in this particular situation? But once you've thought about that, and you realize that, no, I'm just being reasonable about this, and this person is just telling me to be positive anyway, when particular people are constantly demanding this kind of positive, supposedly positive response for whenever things get difficult, whenever there's a real challenge, they just, you have to be more positive. They are basically telling you that they either can't or won't be supportive when facing real problems in life, because they will instead insist on this positivity and avoid any useful analysis, avoid any sort of productive conversation with you about what the problem is. Again, even if it's their own problem in the first place, you're not really going to be able to get through to them in most cases, because, the only coping mechanism they have is this idea that everything around them has to be positive and has to reinforce their self-esteem and their positive emotional state. These kinds of people ultimately are fair weather friends at best, and they're usually incapable of empathizing with someone or showing compassion during a type of difficult situation, nor can they handle, like I say, their own problems when supposedly, quote, negative issues arise. The best option is usually to not approach people, such as members of the positivity police, whom you know aren't going to be helpful. They're ultimately just going to give you some kind of nonsense. And instead to work on actually resolving the problems and achieving the goals that you need to achieve, and dealing with what they would call the negative aspects of whatever it is that you're trying to do, despite the reactions that they give, despite this kind of, again, this pretense of compassion, this fake substitute, this cheap substitute for empathy that telling someone to be positive all the time really is. Again, guys, just as a couple of final examples, this idea that things could always be worse, that means the exact same thing. It means, I don't really care about your problem. Why are you telling me about this? I'm either too immature to deal with it, or I really am not your friend in the first place, so talking to me is a waste of time. When someone says something like things could always be worse, and it's already a bad situation, again, it's not a matter of you being upset about something minor and taking and blowing it out of proportion, and they tell you things could be worse than that. It's a matter of you have something serious going on, and these people are just not supportive. Again, Stardusk mentioned that he had a friend whose father had passed away recently, and there were some women who were telling this guy, and I think mostly it's men who are told these kinds of things, more often than women are. But, they were saying, oh, cheer up. You shouldn't be so depressed, basically, because he was sad because his father had died recently. This is how ridiculous this mindset is sometimes. Because, again, I agree that a lot of it is because we have this level of safety in our society, as Stardust mentioned, that we have this level of security, and so people are just kind of removed from the natural world, and they're removed from reality because they don't have to deal with it directly. But a lot of it is the education system reinforcing this as well, telling people that it's all about your self-esteem. Even when I was a kid in the 90s, that's how it was, in the mid and late 90s. Everything's just about self-esteem and how you feel, and everything's equal. No matter how crappy of a job you do, it's equal to what somebody else did. This mentality, I think, it is really making it difficult for kids as they grow up to be able to deal with quote-unquote negative situations. And so they have this kind of defense mechanism of everything has to be positive because that's, like I said, that's what reinforces their self-esteem. But this idea that things could always be worse. Would you go up to a man in the hospital who was dying from cancer and say, things could always be worse? You could be on fire right now, too. I mean, that's how absurd that idea. And I've seen some people that they'll say this all the time. They'll actually take pride in this. I always tell people things could always be worse. It's just like when people say those kinds of things, I want to keep my distance from them. And that's the kind of conclusion that I want to really kind of reach in this video. That's the point that I'm really trying to make more than anything, is when you see people who are part of this cult of positivity or positivity police, you have to realize that they're using that as a substitute for being supportive, as a substitute for dealing with the real world for what it is in a lot of cases, especially if you're not being overly negative. And the best thing to do is to just kind of try to avoid these people, because no matter how much pain you may be experiencing with something, or no matter how negative the situation really is, they're always going to insist on being positive, and they just, again, they really have not matured into adults, or if they have, they're not really willing to be supportive to you to begin with, and they just can't be honest about that in a lot of situations because, like I say, of the social and kind of psychological consequences of that. So again, like a lot of my videos, the point is this is a red flag with people. You probably don't want to put much effort into developing close ties with people who think that you should be positive all the time, because they're not going to deal with real world problems when they come up.